All right. So this article reads Burkina Faso's Renaissance. How a 36-year-old leader achieved 18% GDP growth in 2 years while challenging Western hegemony. So, in a remarkable economic turnaround, Burkina Faso's GDP has surged 18.8 billion to 22.1 billion during Ibrahim Traoré's tenure, striking an 18% growth rate in just 2 years. This West African nation, long subject to foreign influence and exploitation, is writing a new chapter in its history under Africa's youngest head of state. So, how did a 36-year-old military officer manage to achieve what decades of IMF-backed policies could not? And what does Burkina Faso's transformation tell us about the contentious relationship between Western powers and their former African colonies? Burkina Faso, whose name translates to land of upright people, is a landlocked country, approximately 22 million inhabitants in West Africa. Despite possessing abundant natural resources, particularly gold, the nation has long struggled with poverty, political instability, and the lingering effects of French colonialism. The country's modern history has been punctuated by frequent military coups, the most significant being in 1983 revolution led by Thomas Sankara, that was widely regarded as Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara's brief tenure was marked by radical reforms, Pan Africanism, and resistance to Western economic influence. His assassination in 1987, widely believed to have been orchestrated with French and American backing, ushered in decades of neo-colonial policies under a former friend, Blaise Compaoré. Western imperialism in Burkina Faso began with the French colonialization in the late 19th century. The territory then was known as Upper Volta, which was subjected to resource extraction, forced labor, and cultural suppression. Even after formal independence in 1960, France maintained significant control through what critics call Frankified, getting Franctified, a system of political and economic military ties that perpetuated French influence in its former colonies. So these mechanisms of post-colonial control were having the CFA franc, which recently Burkina Faso was used the West African CFA franc, which was a currency controlled by the French treasury, requiring member countries to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in Paris. There was also a military presence where France maintained military bases in the region under the guise of counterterrorism operations. French companies also enjoyed privileged access to Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, particularly gold and manganese, and structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank forced privatization on the country, forced austerity measures, and forced market liberalization that usually often benefited Western corporations at the expense of the local development. Dr. Amanita Traoré, a former Malian minister of culture, summed it up this relationship pretty succinctly. Africa is not poor, it's being looted. So, no discussion of Burkina Faso's struggle against imperialism is complete without examining the transformative 4-year rule of Thomas Sankara in 1983 to 1987. His presidency was characterized by a radical self-sufficiency policies that include massive vaccination campaigns that immunized about 2.5 million children against things like meningitis and yellow fever and measles. And he did it all in just a week. He also managed to plant 10 million trees to combat desertification and build schools, health centers, water reservoirs. He increased agricultural production by 250% in just 3 years. He promoted women's rights, including banning the female genital mutilation and forced marriages, and continued to reject foreign aid and external debt payments. He famously said, "He who feeds you controls you." So his independence from Western influence made him dangerous to foreign interests. So on October 15th, 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup led by his former friend. Declassified documents have since revealed the CIA involvement in the assassination, and France's role is widely suspected. Campore would go on to rule for 27 years, reversing most of Sankar's policy and realigning the country with Western economic interests. During this period, Burkina Faso became increasingly dependent on IMF and World Bank loans, with the said stringent conditions. So Campore was ousted in a popular uprising in 2014, and Burkina Faso experienced a period of political instability, culminating in 2 coups in 2022. The second brought Captain Ibrahim Traoré to power. So at 34 years old when he took office, Traoré became the world's youngest head of state. But what set him apart was not just his youth, but his explicit invocation of Thomas Sankar's legacy and his blunt rejection of Western influence. "We are not a colony anymore," he said in a speech that electrified the nation. "Our people deserve dignity, sovereignty, and control over their resources." In just 2 years, he's implemented sweeping reforms that have yielded 18% growth, slashed ministerial and parliamentary salaries by 30% while increasing civil servant wages by 50%. He paid off local debts and rejected any new IMF and World Bank loans. He nationalized 2 gold mines and halted the export of refined gold to Europe. And the agricultural sector has seen particularly impressive gains. You have crop production in 2022 to 2024 increased 300,000 tons of tomatoes, millet, rice, etc. So these agricultural gains, particularly significant in a country where approximately 80% of the population depends on subsistence for farming in their livelihoods. And of course, his policies predictably generated significant backlash from Western powers. So as this happened, France withdrew its ambassador and terminated the military cooperation. The IMF issued warnings about, quote, unsustainable economic policies, and the World Bank suspended new lending. Western media outlets labeled him an authoritarian and a dictator, as they did with Gaddafi. So in April 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron caused a diplomatic fury across Africa when he claimed, quote, Africa is too immature to thrive on its own, a statement widely condemned as revealing the persistent colonial mentality in European capitals. Traoré's response was defiant. The days when Africa's destiny was decided in Paris, London, or Washington are over. We will build our own future with the partners who respect our sovereignty. So the United States has long maintained a significant intelligence presence in Burkina Faso and the broader Sahel region. Declassified documents have revealed CIA involvement in monitoring and sometimes undermining governments perceived as threats to American interests. During the Cold War, Thomas Sankar's socialist policies and alignment with figures like Fidel Castro placed him firmly in the CIA's crosshairs. Historical records now confirm the agency provided intelligence to support Campore ahead of the 1987 coup. More recently, WikiLeaks documents revealed that U.S. maintained an extensive intelligence network in Burkina Faso, with particular focus on monitoring the country's gold sector and relations to China and Russia. Traoré has taken steps to limit the foreign intelligence operations, expelling several suspected operatives and restricting the activities of Western NGOs with alleged intelligence connections, which everybody should be made aware that institutions like the USAID that are made for international development get caught all the time trying to spread anti-communist manifestos, and famously in Cuba and other places. So the IMF, we always talk about the IMF and the relationship that they've had with certain countries and the debt cycles that they put them in. But their relationship with Burkina Faso, it really exemplifies the criticisms that are mostly attributed to the IMF and these types of institutions. So between 91 and 2020, Burkina Faso implemented numerous IMF-backed structural adjustment programs. And structural adjustment is code for belt tightening, forced austerity measures. So they forced them to privatize their state enterprises, and then they often sold them at a bargain prices to foreign investors and foreign corporations. They made them reduce the public spending, particularly on healthcare and education, which is very typical of the IMF. They made them remove the agricultural subsidies, leading to increased food security, making them more dependent on imports from other countries. And then, of course, what comes with the neoliberals is the trade liberalization that flooded local markets with imported goods. That can't be overstated, because that's one of the ways that you can destroy a country, is by controlling the food, not just by having not enough food, but having too much cheap food from other places. So, of course, these policies failed to deliver as the promised economic transformation. And despite decades of IMF assistance, Burkina Faso remained one of the poorest countries in the world, with 40% of the population living below the poverty line, which the poverty line is set by the World Bank anyway, so it's a strange metric. Traoré's rejection of the IMF loans in favor of domestic resource mobilization represents a dramatic break with the past. So he says, we cannot continue to follow economic recipes that have failed us for 30 years. He told his people in a national address. So his economic reforms have unfolded against the backdrop of serious security crisis, because Burkina Faso has faced an insurgency led by jihadist groups, resulting in thousands of deaths and over 2 million internally displaced persons. The security situation has been complicated by the legacy of Western intervention in the region, particularly the NATO-led overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, which destabilized the entire Sahel region. So he declared a general mobilization to fight insurgency, recruiting about 50,000 civilian volunteers to supplement the regular armed forces. And they withdrawn from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and formed the Alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger, two countries that have similarly rejected the Western influence. And I think ECOWAS is a Western backed kind of project. So even though the guy is amazing and what he's doing is amazing for the people of his country, there's still things about him that are controversial. So in March 2023, Burkina Faso's transitional parliament passed legislation criminalizing homosexuality with penalties up to 5 years imprisonment. And so this law has been, of course, widely condemned by human rights organizations, and not a great thing for the LGBTQ plus folks in that country. But additionally, there's been concerns about the freedom of the press and journalists facing harassment and detention for critical reporting. And organizations like Reporters Without Borders have noticed deteriorating environment for independent journalism, which, to be fair, Western journalists probably don't have any business in a country. If they've been made it perfectly clear that they'd like to try things on their own, I don't see why it's important we meddle in the affairs of other countries. It seems to be a recipe for disaster we always fall into. So as these kind of human rights concerns can be a cudgel that we, the West, use to beat over the heads of the people to justify regime change. And I would not pay too much attention to the claims of being authoritarian. And, many authoritarian governments now existing that have very low crime rates and are increasing the standard of living for the people that live there. You never know. Democracy has its problems. I don't think any system's perfect. Humans are invariably flawed, but This is certainly an interesting time to be alive. So let's talk about his popular support. Traoré is pretty popular among the people there. Recent surveys indicate that 66% of the citizens now accept military rule, which was up from 24% in 2012. So that was a dramatic shift in public sentiment that reflects uh, security concerns and approval of his economic nationalism. The generational enthusiasm is captured by the 24-year-old students who said, "For the first time in my life, I feel like our country belongs to us, not France or the IMF." So what he's planned to do is pretty good, and he's vowed to stay in power till at least 2029, giving him time to consolidate all of his reforms. So what they're going to do is construct a new airport in Ouagadougou with a projected capacity of 1 million passengers, expand the domestic manufacturing sector, specifically agricultural processing, development of national pharmaceutical industry, which is good, and a comprehensive reform of the education system. So may or may not pull it off, but we're rooting for him. But by rejecting Western economic orthodoxy and embracing resource nationalism, the country has achieved a lot in a short period of time. In the words of Traoré himself, our struggle is not just for Burkina Faso, it is for all of Africa and for all peoples who believe that there is another world, one of dignity, sovereignty, and justice, and that it's possible. Pretty wonderful, wonderful story here. Not too bad.